Good evening, everybody. So good to see a crowd like this for an important lecture. I'd like to introduce to you somebody I've known for a few years. I know most of you know her as well, but in different capacities. So Yuliia Ivaniuk, I'm going to read this so I don't forget. She obtained her Bachelor of Arts degree in International Relations in Military Sphere at the Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv. And she also has a Master of Arts degree in Peace and Conflict Studies here at the University of Manitoba, and that's where I met her. She has extensive volunteer experience as well, including with the OSCE, NATO, the International Women's Club of Kyiv, and currently she serves on the board of St. Andrews Management, and she's really passionate about advocating for social justice and positive peace for all. And she's drawn on her experiences for this talk from her life as a Ukrainian citizen, and also from literature, from Ukrainian, Russian, and English language sources, to talk to us today about Chernobyl, from reactor to reaction. I really thank you for coming and sharing this information with us, Yuliia, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. Today I am going to talk about Chernobyl, the event that knows no man-made boundaries, the catastrophe that has proven to the USSR, the world, and humanity in general the perils of the atom. Namely, today I am going to talk about the background of disaster and the response to it in Ukraine as well as internationally. I'll compare the HBO's dramatic TV series to the actual events, and I'll talk about some of the international implications of Chernobyl, and in particular the implications on the international legal system. According to an article published in the Soviet Life magazine, the odds of a meltdown are 1 in 10,000 years. And even if the incredible should happen, the automatic control and safety systems would shut down in a matter of seconds. One of the chief designers of the RBMK type reactors proclaimed that this type of reactor is as safe as a samovar in the middle of the Red Square. And for those of you who don't know what a samovar is, it's a Russian type of tea kettle. One of the chief designers at the Chernobyl power plant stated that the power plant is 100% safe. It is so safe that its cooling waters are being used for large-scale fish breeding. And I personally like fish, but that does not sound like a good idea to me. As you can see, in 1980s, the Soviet Union could be characterized by a culture of technological giantism and positivism. While it is wise to account for mistakes, in particularly in the nuclear field, they did not choose to do so. Why? Well, because accidents never happened in USSR. They could happen in the United Kingdom, in the United States, or in France, but never in the USSR. And at the same time, nuclear power was perceived as a source of national pride and a hope for salvation in times of economic crisis, and as a way to prove to the West and to eventually outcompete the West in many different ways. But if nuclear reactors were as safe as samovars, I would not be talking to you about this today, and this phone call would never have happened. From the HBO's dramatic TV series, and it is based on the actual phone call that happened on the night of April 26. In 1980s, in Soviet Union, there were two types of reactors. One of them was the pressurized light water moderated and cooled reactor, the type of reactor that used water as a moderator and water as a coolant. And also there were the RBMKs. In Russian, that is Reactor большой мощности канальный, which means in English a type of reactor that uses graphite as a moderator and water as a coolant. So, despite the common belief, Chernobyl was not the first accident that happened to an RBMK-type reactor. And you can clearly see on this board that there were a number of accidents that happened prior to Chernobyl. However, they were being kept secret. They were being kept secret not only from the general public, but also from the scientific community. So if something similar was to happen in the future, they could never prevent it, or because they simply didn't know that such things were existing. And because at that time, the Soviet Union was a totalitarian society with an information embargo imposed on every levels of it. And the cost of human tragedy never mattered as much as the perception of safety, security, and prosperity on all the levels. So today I would like to talk about several of them. So first, the 1958 Kyshtym disaster. Even today, it is the third largest nuclear accident that has ever happened in the world, after Fukushima and after Chernobyl. As a result of it, a territory larger than the New York City was left uninhabitable. And the Soviets managed to keep it secret. Even though the United States did find out about the disaster, they at that time chose not to disclose it to their population, as the United States were interested in building their own nuclear program. So of course they didn't want to admit that such problems happened in other areas of the world. The other one is the 1979 Leningrad accident. It happened due to a control rod misfunction. And I'm not going to go too much into detail about the control rods at this point, but I'll just say that if the engineers and the operators at Chernobyl had known of the control rod misfunctions, accident in Chernobyl might never have happened. And the third one is the Chernobyl accident of 1982, which so few people know about. It happened at the reactor number 1. And as a result of it, the levels of radioactivity raised 10 times higher than the permissible level, which was not safe. And the same rule also applied to the numerous mining accidents and the numerous factory accidents, which were kept secret from the general population as well as from the media. And once again, why? Because accidents never happened. And we don't even have to go too deep into the history to find a more recent example, such as, let's think of summer 2019 and the recent nuclear submarine tests that took place in Russia. They did not disclose about such tests happening until 3 days after, when the levels of dangerous radionuclear activity gave itself away. So as you can see, the Soviet Union and still, unfortunately, a lot of post-Soviet societies can be characterized by a culture of patriotism, negative patriotism, in a way where a person needs to be able to sacrifice themselves in order to save the motherland, or it's almost like they live to be able to sacrifice themselves at some point of their life. And in terms of this, Svetlana Alexievich, the author of the book Voices of Chernobyl, who also won a Nobel Prize for her literary works, writes, "People don't have meaning. Propaganda offers you to gain meaning by death. Human suffering is the main capital." And even for those of you who have watched the HBO dramatic TV series, they are sharing a poem about the great bitter land that I am born to defend. And just this very sentence tells you a lot how your motherland does not always have to only bring positive associations to the person, but first, duty comes first. So there were a number of systemic mistakes that led to the Chernobyl disaster in the first place. One of them is location. Chernobyl is located in the territory of Polisa, which is several hundred kilometers north of Kiev. And it is characterized by sandy podzolic marshlands, where groundwaters are located quite close to the surface. Also, according to the Harvard scholar Serhiy Plokhy, 90% of the territory of Ukraine can be characterized by extremely complex geological structures, which are not favorable for the construction of nuclear power plants. And as you know, at that time there were 5 of them, and even today there are still 4 of them functioning. Also, there were a number of unique features of the RBMK type reactors that were not exactly safe. First of all, its lack of containment structure. While a safe reactor should have a containment, just in case something does happen to sustain radiation, Chernobyl didn't need one, and I know I've said this sentence a lot, but why? Because accidents didn't happen. Like, that is almost like funny in a very sad and morbid way. So they decided not to build one. Also, they used graphite as a moderator, which eventually did catch fire and was not safe from the beginning. Also, the control rod design had some major flaws, as it functioned based on the positive void coefficient, which was rather hard for the operators to control, and they actually didn't know that it functioned based on the positive void coefficient. They always believed that it functioned based on the negative void coefficient. So of course, when you don't know exactly how something works, that might lead to an accident eventually. Also, according to Valery Legasov's tapes, a safe reactor should have minimum 2 emergency shutdown mechanisms. One of them should be automatic and the other one should be manually controlled. Well, Chernobyl was equipped with the manually controlled one. It did not have the second automatic emergency shutdown mechanism, which could be helpful, especially in this case. And at the same time, it didn't have the proper password encrypted protection, which meant that if some of the workers were to decide to use it not in very good ways, they totally could. So that wasn't safe at all. Also, the roof was built in violation of fire standards, and it eventually did catch fire as well. And there was lack of accountability on each and every level, because first of all, the government was the one who made decisions regarding the building of nuclear power plants. The government was the one who was in charge of building the very power plant, and also the government was the one who oversaw the functioning of the power plant. So there was no individual vigilante, no separate actor who could say and who could come and say something is not working right, changes are needed. So that led to some negative results as well. And also, according to David Marples, Chernobyl became the university of construction for a lot of its construction workers, as they learned based on the method of trial and error how to work with a nuclear power plant. For a lot of them, it was their first experience, and it is very interesting that after reactor number 1 was completed, a number of workers were being transferred to a different power plant in Russia. So they had a shift of very new people, which of course led to the slackening of standards. Also, RBMKs in general were cheaper and faster to build, and they were designed to produce large amounts of electricity really fast, as they originated from the technology that was used for military purposes. So they were not very well equipped for the civil use. There's a very interesting article published by a Ukrainian journalist, Lyubov Kovalivska, in Literaturna Gazeta back in March 1986, in which she says that the inability of engineering staff to organize themselves resulted in slackening of standards. It is very interesting how she got access to that information, because at that time, any type of information related either to the military or the peaceful atom was 100% classified. So she went to the local archives and she just simply told the gentleman in charge that she'd like to get access to the archives to publish a report, as she was working on a project that was assigned to her by her local newspaper. And the gentleman in charge thought that a woman would never be able to make sense of the numbers. So he just let her in. And it turned out that she did make sense of the numbers, and she published a report. As a result of which, she wrote that 70% of supplies that were being brought into the power plant were defective, and they were used. So, you know, when they ask you the questions about why certain accidents happen, like, they're quite often might be more than one factor to it. Also, there were unrealistic timelines of construction. While the Chernobyl power plant should have been built in 7 years, it was built in 5 years. Because the Soviet Union liked to work based on quotas and based on artificially imposed deadlines that they brought upon themselves. So they thought it would be much better to complete the reactors faster than expected, and they did it by sacrificing the quality. Also, it is very interesting that each and every reactor at the Chernobyl power plant was opened in December. Why December? Well, December is the year end, and if you want to get vacation, you want to get a raise, in Soviet Union it would have to be completed by December because that's the year end. And apart from systemic malfunctions, there were a number of mistakes that were done by the shift operators on that night as well. So initially, emergency power test was planned to be conducted on the evening of April 25th. However, the operators received a call from Kiev asking them to keep the electricity going for the night, as once again there were certain production quotas in Kiev area in terms of their factories that needed to be fulfilled, so they asked to postpone the test until the midnight. As a result of it, the shift who was not previously notified of the experiment, the shift who has never conducted the test, and the shift of rather young people who were during their first years of working at a nuclear power plant were left to conduct the test. And let's see a little video of how it was all happening.
Oh, sorry. This is all we can get. 200 megawatts. Pulled almost everything out.
That's all we have, that's all we have.
But the test requires 700.
Steliachuk, let's get ready. Switch on pump 4.
Oh, wait a second.
Steliachuk,
We have barely enough steam as it is. The turbine is going too slow for the test to deliver any valid results. And if we add more water, there will be even
I
less.
said it's enough. I know what I'm doing. Steliachuk.
Main pump 4 connected. We should warn Chuk, the pipes are going to be jumping.
Never mind him. Kirstenbach.
And the steam in the separator drum is too low, 5 atmospheres.
All right, let's all help him. Get it up as best you can.
We should stop.
Turn that fucking thing off.
So at 5 a.m. the reactor is at a state of quiet slumber. It is basically shut down for fuel change and maintenance. The water supply is disabled. The turbines are spinning at 7% of their normal speed. The operators decide to start the test and they reduce the power. The power keeps on going down and down and down. And while they should have stopped the reaction and disabled the reactor immediately, they decide to carry on with the test and raise the power manually. As a result, the temperatures start skyrocketing with every second until they reach an unprecedented level. They attempt to push on the stop button. However, for some reasons, it doesn't help. As a result, 2 explosions happen. One of them caused by excess of steam, the other by excess of hydrogen. As a result, the core is basically cut open and 5% of nuclear fuel is being released into atmosphere, which produces 50 million curies of radiation, which is similar to 50 Hiroshima bombs. And while there is no consensus in between scientists whether the stop button was pressed or not, or whether it played a major role in the explosion or not, a lot do believe that the misfunction of the stop button was the final straw that led to the disaster. So here is the map of the Chernobyl power plant, and as you can see, Unit 1 and Unit 2 were twin units, as well as Unit 3 and 4. So it basically means that the 2 of them shared a wall and were interconnected. So if something was to happen to one of the units, it was very likely to spread to the other. So in case of Chernobyl, an explosion happened at the reactor's roof number 4, and there was actually a danger that the fire could spread to the twin unit number 3, which could in the end cause a much larger explosion, which could devastate all of Europe. And at that time, actually, it is very interesting that they were working on the construction of units 5 and 6. So they would be somewhere around here. And if they had carried on with that, Chernobyl would be the largest nuclear power station in the world at that time. So this is Unit 4 after the explosion. And it is very interesting if you look at some of the videos that the Soviet media published immediately after the catastrophe. They filmed the reactor from the front stage where you couldn't see the explosion, and they said something like, "Dear comrades, look, nothing has happened. There's no damage." I tried to include that video here, but it was of a very bad quality, so it was hard to see. So now off to the movie, the part that is probably the most fun, if there is a fun part here. So first of all, I would like to highly recommend those who have not yet had a chance to watch the HBO's dramatic TV series to watch it, because it is an incredible work, and I would say it is extremely accurate, even though there are some rules of the dramatic genre that need to be followed. Overall, the authors really managed to capture the delicacies of the Soviet, of the Slavic nature. And you can think about such little and unimportant things as nodding. For example, while your average Western person would nod by moving their head down, a Slavic person moves by moving their head up and then down. I checked it on myself, and I definitely do it subconsciously, but I could never think of it myself that I do that. I would like to briefly go over some of the major differences that I was able to spot in between the movie and the reality. And the reality for me was based on, majority of it was based on the CIA sources and Sergei Plokhy's work in Chernobyl. So first of all, I'm sure a lot of you would remember an episode about the Bridge of Death in the movie, where lots of families together with children came out to the bridge to look at the burning reactor from far. And you could see little pieces of ash falling on them. While this was used in movie for stronger dramatic effect, that would not have happened in reality because, as all of us know, radiation is not visible to human eye. Well, unfortunately it is not visible, because perhaps if it were visible, they would have taken it more seriously. Also, the other one is the episode with the helicopter crash. I'm sure a lot of you would remember that from the movie that helicopters were being used to dump bags full of boron, sand, clay and lead on the on the core of the nuclear reactor. And while the crash did happen in real life, it happened in October, which was much later than it was portrayed in the movie. It was in the first couple of days after the explosion. Also, a lot of you would remember the episode about the 3 brave divers who volunteered themselves to go underneath the reactor to open the valves and to save everyone. While this did happen in real life, and the 3 brave men actually survived it, and 2 of them are still alive today, the BBC interviewed one of them, and he said that none of them volunteered to do it. They were on a shift. So he simply said, "It was my job to go. Nobody else knew how to do it. Nobody else knew where the valves were." And he said, "If I hadn't done it, I would be fired. So I didn't even think about not doing it." And after he had gotten out, nobody offered him a compensation like it was done in the movie, and nobody clapped for him, unlike the movie, unfortunately, because they were not perceived as heroes. It was just their job to do it. Also, a lot of you would remember an episode about soldiers cleaning up the roof from the radioactive debris. And in the movie, they were allowed to stay on the roof for not longer than 90 seconds. While that was the official rule, the Soviets didn't quite comply with the rule because it was much easier to have the same people do the job over and over and over again than trying to bring in new people, new resources, and training them again. So as a result of that, a lot of people received much higher doses of radiation than that was by any norms acceptable. And it is also kind of interesting that the zones of the roof were, basically the roof would be somewhere around here. The zones of the roof were split into different areas, and they gave areas female names based on how dangerous the zones were. So Masha was the most dangerous one, the one that nobody wanted to go to. And in terms of this, also Svetlana Alexievich interviewed one of the men who was on the roof cleaning up the debris, and I'd like to share a quote that he said. "They will never be Dutch or German. They will never have perfect asphalt or manicured lawns, but we'll always have plenty of heroes." So that very much summarizes what people felt and why they did what they did at that time. A lot of you would remember the character of Uliana Chomyuk from the movie, as she was actually she is a fictional character, and she does not exist in real life, but she was used to represent the voices of the many scientists who worked to deal with the consequences of Chernobyl, and as a voice of reason, voice of justice, voice of not agreeing with the system and with the many violations of human rights that were going on at the same time. But Adam Higginbotham, in his book Midnight in Chernobyl, writes about the real-life female hero. Her name is Maria Pretsanko. She was born in China, grew up in Kazakhstan, and moved to the Ukrainian USSR to work as the chief architect in Pripyat. So she was responsible for building many buildings in Pripyat, and after the explosions had happened, she was put in charge of evacuations. And actually it is funny that she herself believed that they would be able to come back after a few months. And even until today, she still regrets not coming back to the city that she loved so dearly. Everybody seemed to really love Pripyat because it was built as an idyllic city, as a city of the future, which had a lot of things that other cities in the Soviet Union didn't have. So a lot of people were affected by it severely. The other character is Viktor Bryukhanov. He is quite a polarizing figure. While in the movie he is depicted as one of the villains, in real life I would say he is more of a sympathetic character. So he was the director of the power plant, and he was also in charge of building the city of Chernobyl. And it is very interesting that he had rather strong constraints imposed on him by the Soviets, where with one budget he was expected to build a functioning power plant and the city. And since Chernobyl was meant to be the idyllic city of the future that could be portrayed in magazines and newspapers for the Western media, he was asked to build such things as two swimming pools, tennis courts, gym, at a country that suffered from major deficits. At that time, people in many cities of Ukraine had to wait in line to get milk or cheese. And it is very interesting that at that time at Chernobyl, you could get all of those delicacies. You could even buy fresh tomatoes and bananas, which in times of the Soviet Union was something just absolutely extraordinary. And everybody wanted to live here in Pripyat. So after Chernobyl had happened, he failed to evacuate people in time, and he reported the lowest amount of radiation possible to the Kiev and Moscow authorities. And While it is hard to say what exactly his reasoning was behind it, his own wife stayed with him until the last moment and were not evacuated any faster than the rest of people. So perhaps he just he suffered from the Orwellian doublethink when he knew what had happened, but he refused to believe fully that it could be going on. And when after the immediate effects of the disaster had been dealt with, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison together with 5 other people. And actually he was shamed publicly. His mother died of a heart attack because of the bad reputation that he received. He was portrayed by the majority of Soviet media as the villain and the person responsible for the catastrophe, even though he directly did not do anything wrong. I would say at the court he behaved extremely honorably. He said each of us had a role to play in the disaster, but there were major malfunctions in the very design of the RBMK reactor that nobody was aware of. And they honestly did not believe that accidents could happen to RBMK type reactors, and they were really surprised when something did happen. He died a year ago, and up until the last moment of his life, he refused to give any interviews to the media. The other man is Vasily Kizima. While he was not portrayed in the movie, I would say he was a very important liquidator and person in terms of Chernobyl. He was in charge of construction of the Chernobyl power plant, and he was a very interesting man because he himself asked the authorities to make the deadlines shorter, and he himself failed to deliver. So one day he was asked to come to Kyiv to talk to the KGB about why the construction quotas are not being fulfilled, and he was he had a character, and he just responded to them. St. Sophia Cathedral wasn't built in a day, it took centuries to build. It is still standing, so that's what I am going for. And then he crossed himself, which in the Soviet Union, in the country that was 100% atheist and where religion was punishable, was an extremely brave move to make. But he did it, and they let him go, just because of the type of man he was. And after the explosion, he was put in charge of the construction workers that helped with many various functions, and he became one of the major liquidators as well. And I believe that he is still alive today. Anatoly Dyatlov. If you remember the previous episode about the evil guy screaming at his younger comrades, that is the man. He was portrayed as a villain in the HBO's dramatic TV series, and perhaps he was the villain. He was a nuclear engineer by trade, and he previously worked on a nuclear submarines. So he was an extremely knowledgeable guy. However, he had an extremely difficult character, and a lot of his fellow workers later described him as an extremely difficult person to work with. He was in charge of the test on that night, and after the explosion had happened, he ordered to restart the plant and cool down the reactor. He asked them to shut down the ventilation, and he sent 2 of his younger co-workers to go check on the core, as a result of which they both died. So it is unclear whether he really knew what had happened, because it seems like based on his knowledge he should have known, or whether he was just too arrogant to accept that there could be any dangerous implications to this. He was also among the people who were sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, he suffered from an immense amount of radiation, and he wasn't able to fully complete his sentence. He was released for good behavior and for health reasons, and shortly after that he died. Until the last day of his life, he remained stating that the only mistake was with the shutdown button, that no mistakes were made by the operators or by anyone in the shift, it was just the red button. The other one is Nikolai Fomin. If you remember the my earlier phrase about the Chernobyl's nuclear waters being used for fish breeding, he was the man who behind the quote. And it is interesting that he said that even after the 1982 accident, as a result of which levels of radioactivity rose 10 times higher than the permissible norm. So he was not exactly a very ethical man. He was also put into trial for what had happened, as he was the second superior of the power plant, and he suffered from severe mental health issues, and while being in custody he broke his own glasses and tried to cut his veins and commit suicide. He was rescued from that, and after serving the sentence he was released, and he's actually still alive. Valery Legasso, he was the true hero in the story, in the HBO dramatic TV series, and perhaps in life. Unlike the movie, he was not an expert on the RBMK type reactors. He was a nuclear chemist. So he himself had a lot to learn about how the RBMKs worked. He actually had a wife and children, unlike how he was portrayed in the movie as a single man. And actually his wife wrote a diary about his life after his death. He was the man who was behind the idea to dump bags filled with sand and other things on the reactor core, for which he was severely criticized by many of his colleagues, as later they realized that the nuclear fuel burned itself out by itself, and there was no need to dump things on top of it, which rose the levels of radiation to an even higher extent. But I would say at that time it was an event of an unprecedented level. It was hard to know whether the nuclear fuel had burned itself out or not. It was hard to know what was going on. Exactly, so perhaps that sacrifice was justifiable in a way. So he was sent by the Soviet Union to represent them at the International Atomic Agency's meeting to provide a report on the RBMK type reactors and on Chernobyl case. He spoke there for 4 hours, and he described in detail the structure of the RBMK type reactor, after which he was hated by the Soviet scientists severely because they believed that he had shared too much. Those of you who had seen the movie would see an episode where he came to the court meeting and he told them all the truth about what he felt the reasons behind the catastrophe were. That episode never happened in real life. However, he did produce tape recordings of his version of truth, which are actually still available on YouTube, and you can watch them, where he talked about some of the major design flaws of the RBMK, and he also blamed Dyatlov for what had happened severely. So after the Chernobyl, he was denied a lot of the expected career promotions, and he was really looking forward to receiving a Medal of the Hero of Socialist Labor, which he was not given at that time, because a lot of the scientists and a lot of the higher-ups did not agree with him. As a result of it, he committed suicide at the second-year anniversary of the tragedy. And actually, a lot of scientists say that it is due to him that a lot of the Soviet authorities decided to take a look at the structure of the RBMK type reactor and implement the changes that he proposed in his tapes. Now off to some theories. I would say that Chernobyl is a perfect example of the Swiss cheese model of accident causation. In this model, a system of defenses against an accident can be compared to a number of slices of Swiss cheese, where holes, similarly to hazards, if lined up in a certain way, lead to an accident. So in terms of Chernobyl, we had a number of latent conditions, or I'd say systemic mistakes. So a lot of them I have already outlined, so such as lack of confinement structure, unsafe reactor, using graphite as a moderator, major control rod misfunctions, misfunctioning red button. At the same time, there were a number of active failures, such as the very actions that were taken by the ship on that night, deciding to lower the power to a drastic level, shutting down the water supply, and then withdrawing all the control rods at the same time was an action that was never taken before and which did not well end for them. So as you can see, it is not just one or two or even three smaller mistakes that lead to an accident of this scale. It is a number of them in combination together. And I would say that the Soviet Union was the only place where a mistake like that could have happened at that time. And Soviet Union was the only place and the only country who could deal with it as well. In terms of immediate aftermath of the disaster, it makes sense to talk about McGuinty's top-down model, in which the top of the societal hierarchy basically makes decisions regarding all the governing in the country. So in terms of evacuations, the local authorities could not make a decision regarding it, as they had to wait for a decision from Moscow. Because the safety and security of people never mattered as much as the perception of safety and the perception of well-being. At the same time, it makes sense to talk about the negative and positive peace models. So while negative peace is absence of conflict or war, positive peace is a holistic model in which the human rights are the major priority in a society, and in which grassroots have a voice and have a say in how the country is governed, which clearly was absent in the Soviet Union case, and Chernobyl served as a perfect example of that. So now off to some of the immediate effects on Ukraine, Belarus, and some of the surrounding countries. So on this map, you can see the map of the nuclear fallout from the catastrophe. So red means the highest concentration on nuclear fallout. You can see a very large area here in the Chernobyl and Pripyat area, and there is quite a large spot here north of the area. So why do we have almost as large of a zone of radiation north of Pripyat as we had in Pripyat and Chernobyl? Well, at that time, Soviets used a seeding technology to bring down the clouds on the northern Ukraine and Belarus, as they were trying to protect Moscow from radioactive rain. So they were able to calculate that the clouds were moving to the east, and they made rain fall in these areas without notifying the people about it. While the idea of sacrificing the few for the many might sound to a certain level justifiable, why weren't the populations notified about it? And some people still live in these areas of Belarus, breathing and eating radioactive products every day. Also, there are some major violations in terms of evacuations. So the explosion happened at 1:23 a.m. on April 26th. At 9 a.m. in the morning, the Swedish found out about the disaster as the radars at one of their nuclear power stations went off, and they were able to calculate that the winds must have been moving from the USSR. They confront one of the Soviet diplomats, asking them, has something happened? And to that the Soviets chose not to respond. And then the Swedish notified the Americans of what had happened, and Americans were able to, the American missile alarm detection systems were able to take pictures from the satellites of the burning reactor. And they could see an open core of a reactor with fire on the roof, and right next to it they could see a football field with children playing football. They could see the river of Pripyat and a ship going down, and they could see people fishing. So the Americans were confused. They were like, how is it possible? Is there something we are not catching here? What is going on? Well, apparently it took the Soviet Union 36 hours to evacuate the city of Pripyat. So basically for a day and a half, the people were going about doing their normal business without even knowing about the effects of radiation. And the 30-kilometer zone, like the broader zone here, was evacuated only on May 7th, by which time people already received just immense dosages of radiation. Also, on the 1st of May, as a lot of you would know, it is traditional to have a parade. And in Kiev, there was a major parade held on the 1st of May, on the day when the radioactive cloud was right over Kiev. And some of the Ukrainian authorities in Kiev were actually asked to bring out as many children and teenagers as possible so that they can prove to the West that everything is fine. So that's what they did, and a lot of people speak about it, like half of Europe was evacuated at that time, and Moscow and Kiev are having a parade in the middle of the nuclear disaster. Also, the very many firefighters and first responders were not notified about the dangers of radiation, and they were just going to their death without knowing about it. The 600 liquidators, and by liquidators I mean the many people who were drafted into the zone to help deal with the consequences. So they were not only firemen and some of the first responders, but they were also construction workers. They were people in charge of evacuations, nurses, doctors. There were many people involved in it. None of them were notified about the real effects of radioactivity. And there was a lot of folk medicine going on, and also at that time a lot of doctors were not equipped to deal with it either. So in terms of this, Yuliia writes about how some of the firstly admitted soldiers would come to the hospital and doctors would prescribe them to drink milk, hoping that that would help them cure from radioactive poisoning. Or a lot of people believe that if you drink a lot of vodka, then radiation wouldn't get you. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work. Also, so in terms of this, I'd like to provide another quote by Svetlana Alexievich, which I found really powerful. She says, "Don't write about wonders of Soviet heroism. They existed and they were really wonders. But first there had to be incompetence, negligence, and only then wonders." She writes a story about the true paratroopers, the young men who refused to go into the zone to help clean it up. And as a result of that, they were shamed and they were fired. And if they wouldn't go, there always would be some other people who would say, if he didn't go, I would go. Why? Well, there was a feeling of machoism around it, where you had to prove to everyone that you're strong, you're not afraid of anyone, without really knowing the dangers that you're going to be exposed to. Also, there is also such thing as radiation euphoria, where a lot of people say that while being exposed to extremely high dosages of radiation for several minutes up to half an hour, a person can feel almighty. They feel like they can do anything until after several minutes they start feeling extremely weak and they get nauseous and all the effects come in. Also, there is some major psychological effects, as prior to that, on the political level, the Soviets were able to keep all the accidents secret. Right now they had to admit to the fact that that was no longer possible, and they had to admit that mistakes did happen. There are major health implications as well. So right now they attribute close to 20,000 cases of thyroid cancer in Ukraine to effects of radiation. And actually this area is extremely understudied, because for the majority of time in the 80s and 90s, nobody was interested to study the long-term effects of radiation. And even if some cases did look like they were related to exposure to radiation, they were just dismissed, because the government was just not interested in collecting that type of information. So in Ukraine politically, Chernobyl, I'd say, played a rather major role in its development as a country. First of all, a lot of scholars do say that Chernobyl was among the several reasons that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, as it led to glasnost or openness and perestroika, which means restructuring. So the Soviets understood that they could no longer keep what was happening inside the Soviet Union within the boundaries of the Iron Curtains. They realized that the truth was coming out, and even their own citizens were actually driving to the Carpathians, trying to listen to the tapes from the West to find out what was happening, because since their own media would not tell them the truth, that they'd have to listen to the foreign media. So it was getting harder and harder to keep things secret, and as a result of it, when the Soviet Union does collapse and Ukraine becomes independent, Ukraine inherits the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons. At that time, nuclear arms arsenal was larger than that of China, UK, and France combined. Because of the negative legacy of Chernobyl, because of huge amounts of international pressure, and the desire to disassociate with Russia, they decide to give up their nuclear weapons, and Ukraine signs a Ukrainian Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1994 and the Budapest Memorandum, which assures but does not guarantee the political and territorial inviolability of Ukraine. And all of you know what happened after that with the invasion of Crimea and the conflict in the eastern borders of Ukraine. Okay, another video.
Tomorrowland, promise of things to come.
Here with my right hand I give you the magic fire of the atom.
Here, in fact, is the answer to a dream as old as man himself, a giant of limitless power at man's command.
So nuclear hubris and nuclear arrogance was common not only to the Soviet Union at that time. This video was made in the United States prior to the 3 Mile accident. And in general, nuclear technology was born in a culture of secrecy, where it was believed that the grassroots, the normal people, did not have the capacity to understand it. And in a lot of cases, they chose not to disclose to the people what was happening. And even though these 3 accidents, the 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, are very different in their nature and in the causes that led to it, they had one common line that you can see coming across all of them. That is the fact that the local populations were not informed properly about the effects of radiation and about what had happened. Also, there is a very interesting chronological timeline connecting all of them. So after the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979, the Soviets like to say that all the accidents happen in the West, but they don't happen to the RBMK type reactors. Then the Chernobyl explodes in 1986. And United States, even though in the United States nuclear power plants do become a lot more unpopular and a lot more expensive to build, they still remain to believe that the accidents of the scale that happened to Chernobyl would never happen in the United States until 2011, when Fukushima has a major accident and Fukushima used the American design of reactor. So as you can see, the humans have not yet managed to harness the atom as much as we would like to. And that definitely needs to be taken into account. So Chernobyl had some major implications on the international legal system. First of all, the International Atomic Energy Association takes on a much stronger stance when it comes to nuclear energy all around the world. They create an organ that is meant to test and to check the fact that some reactors need to be built in accordance with the international standards. At the same time, a year after Chernobyl, a number of major conventions are being signed, such as 1987 Convention on Notification of Accidents, after which it is no longer allowed not to let people know about the fact that an accident has taken place, and Convention on Assistance in Events of Accidents, which basically binds people, the world community, to help certain countries respond to the dangers related to nuclear industry. Also, at the same time, a lot of major financial institutions start to take on a much stronger stance and role in helping the weaker countries deal with the consequences of nuclear catastrophes. For example, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development financed the project of the sarcophagus, or the containment that was built in Ukraine. I actually showed it on here, yeah. So you can see, I forgot to mention, the sarcophagus was realized in 2017, and it is supposed to last for 100 more years. So Canada and nuclear energy. First of all, a Canadian, George Lawrence, was among the first to demonstrate a nuclear reaction in the world. And it is interesting that Canada, from the very beginning, was interested in the peaceful use of atom, and never even attempted to develop military, the military atom and nuclear weapons. So by 1947, Canada becomes the leader in developing medical isotopes, and in 1962, a CANDU type reactor is invented, which Canada uses even today, and actually a lot of countries are buying those types of reactors in Canada. And right now, nuclear power represents 15% of all the power generated in Canada, and 50% of it comes, and 50% of Ontario. So right now we live in an extremely volatile world where there are lots of dangers. Dangers of terrorism, dangers of industrial sabotage, and environmental disasters. While we have come up with much safer types of reactors, and newer technologies are being developed each day. For example, the Bill Gates Foundation is working on developing a new type of reactor that would use nuclear-based as fuel, which would be pretty innovative. There still is a lot to learn about the dangers of the atom, and Chernobyl served as a perfect example of that. The bigger question that I'd like to pose today is, how do we power the planet without ruining it, and is nuclear the way to go? Thank you. So now if there are any questions in the audience, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes, please, Dr.
So where were you? You were at the beginning.
Where was I? Sorry.
Well, at the beginning, you obviously you were in Ukraine. Now, when did you find out? When did you?
Oh, my personal story.
Did you find out in elementary school, in secondary school, in high school, in university? Did you not find out till Canada? And what was your first reaction?
So when this happened, I wasn't yet born, so I wasn't able to experience it with my own eyes. But I did find out in school, probably in elementary school. And I remember that from year to year, around the 26th of April, we would get a speech from some of our teachers about Chernobyl, but I don't recollect ever hearing the details of what had happened or why it had happened, or the systemic mistakes that led to it. They would only say, yes, it happened, and people were evacuated. That's it. And while we would take a very detailed look at many different historical events that happened all around the world, we never really touched upon Chernobyl much. And Yeah, so, and my interest was definitely highly generated by the HBO dramatic TV series, and I was really happy to see it. Yeah, just saying from what I've known from my school years would not be much. So I had to do independent research to find out.
Okay, so elementary school or high school? Where would the first contact been?
Probably elementary school, and each year they would tell us just very, very little and the same basic information. So it never grew beyond the very, very basics. Yes.
Okay, you weren't alive, but what did you find out from your parents or within the family? Was anything ever mentioned or discussed?
Well, my parents live around here in Kam'янsk-Podilsky in Western Ukraine, which continued living on their normal lives, going about their own business as normal. There were no evacuations going on there as there weren't in the rest of the population of Ukraine. So they just really didn't know at that time about the dangers of radiation. They just lived on as they normally would. Like I asked my great-grandpa, like, what were you doing on that day? And he was like, I don't know, I think I was painting the walls. That was the response that I got from him. One of my aunts who grew up and lived her whole life in Kiev was affected by it. So at that time she was, I believe, 8 years old. So she was evacuated to stay actually with my great-grandparents in Kam'янsk-Podilsky. But she said that the evacuations didn't take place until June, which would already have been too late, basically, to evacuate people. And that's a very similar story shared by a lot of other people and victims in the area. They said that they would be given iodine pills, but they would be given them in July or in June, when they would have already absorbed enormous amounts of radiations. Yes, please.
I was wondering if the declassification of the KGB files revealed anything interesting about this accident.
Yeah, there was actually a lot of sources that were declassified during the Ukraine's independence, and a lot of it would still never be put in paper. So a lot that you can see is very generalized statements. And if you look at the reports around that time, actually you would not get a lot of detailed information. So there are a number of major reports that concern the evacuations and the decisions that were taken, and it is very interesting that the first Politburo meeting after the disaster took place on Monday. So that was 2 days after the accident, and it was classified as an emergency meeting. And one might wonder, why did you have to wait for 2 days to call in a meeting regarding an emergency? And there's also a lot of information taken from some of the meetings where they're just discussing whether to evacuate or not to evacuate. So they just didn't seem to care really much about the implications of the disaster. They just, the only thing that they were worried about was evacuations, and they were trying to delay it as much as possible. And I would say in Soviet Union there was a very large fear of misinformation. It's almost like today's fake news. Like they were really afraid that if you had the evacuations, then the panic would start and it would spread all around the country. So they tried to postpone it as much as possible. Yes, please.
I think many people in the Soviet Union were quite disillusioned with Gorbachev, right? Who basically came to power in 1985, right? And he was criticizing Stalinism, right? And he initiated glasnost. And here is Chornobyl. And the information is hidden from people for so many days, right? So that was the end of Gorbachev.
He was very interesting figure in it, because on the one hand he always claimed to be not to be a strong supporter of nuclear weapons and actually and of nuclear power, and in particular unsafe nuclear power. And after the accident, actually some heads did fly. So the head of the Soviet Academy of Sciences was fired, and also the head of the ministry responsible for energy at that time was fired as well, a year after the accidents. And a lot of people claim that it was Gorbachev's doing, so he did try to address it in a way. But on the same hand, if you look at some of the reports that he gave and some of the interviews that he provided to the media, for 70% of the time he would talk about the many accidents that happened in the West. He'd be saying, oh, so many accidents happened in Great Britain, in US, and of course accidents happen, that's why Chernobyl happened with us, and never really acknowledged what had happened in Chernobyl and that it did not get the proper attention and the proper evacuation. Yeah. Yes?
My question is, the area where the Chernobyl power plant was built was considerable distance from major population centers. Is that right?
Well, it's not too large. It is several hundred kilometers, probably 200 kilometers from Kiev.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the largest population center was Pripyat, which had 50,000 people, and it was mainly built. And it grew mainly after the construction of the plant, because a lot of people came there to work on a plant or to build a plant.
Right. And the power produced there was used mostly where?
For central Ukraine. So that's why the initial test that was planned to be conducted on the evening was postponed, because basically if they had shut it down, Kiev would be left without electricity.
Mm.
And it is interesting that even after the accident had happened at reactor number 4, reactors 1 and 2 kept on going. They kept on working until 2000s, because these areas needed electricity and they just couldn't shut it down. And so a lot more people were being exposed to it, just trying to manage the reactors number 1 and 2.
And it was also a huge cultural disaster, because that whole area of Policia, right, around Chernobyl, and if you take into consideration all the villages around it, it was always a huge depository of unique Ukrainian folk culture.
It was, and actually it is very interesting, because a lot of people claim that the construction of the power plant in Chernobyl led to the Russification of the area, because a lot of the engineers who would come to work on the construction of the plant would normally come from Russia. While they were extremely intelligent people, they had a level of a snobism, like we are the educated ones and all the rest of you are the Ukrainian-speaking peasants. Mm-hmm. And at that time, actually, after Chernobyl had happened, actually majority of engineers were Russian and majority of firefighters and construction workers were Ukrainian. And after the 90s, in the 90s also, after Chernobyl, in many ways the legacy of the environmental disaster that was created by Chernobyl prompted a lot of Ukrainians to start national movements that they were just like national movements for the Ukrainian language and for Ukrainian culture, because they realized that it wasn't just the ecological implications that Chernobyl had, but also the more nationalistic, wider ones, and it in a way inspired them.
Thank you, Yuliia. I'd like to thank the audience members for coming and showing your interest in this topic. I'd really like to thank you, Yuliia, for sharing your knowledge, and clearly you've done a lot of research on this and passion for the subject. Very articulate evening, very articulate sharing with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you.